And so, again, today I want to talk about repetition in reading and the difference between repetition and novelty. So first, we'll start with the problem. So many people today seem to treat reading like a productivity task, like something to be completed, goals to be met. And there's nothing inherently wrong with saying, I want to read 20 books this year, something like that. But when we are always only looking forwards, we sever depth from continuity. And we get to a point really where we no longer remember what we've read, perhaps not even the titles of the books that we've read in a given year. How many people who say they have read 50 books this year could list the title of every book, let alone the author, and tell you what that book was about? And sure, there's some value in simply reading a book and enjoying it in the moment, but is not the pleasure of reading gaining some sort of long-term familiarity with the text, being able to bring what you've learned, what you've read in conversations, being able to discuss these things? It's one thing to read Shakespeare, but another to be able to bring up a Shakespearean quote or a narrative in a conversation with other people. And it doesn't just have to be, and preferably is not, this flurry of modern non-fiction books, self-help books, but literary books, fiction, that you can read and quote, become ingrained into your psyche. Like I believe I mentioned before in one of my Zettelkasten videos, is the more you familiarize yourself with this material, the more it just becomes something you can quote, like a TV show you've seen many times. And one of the ways you can do this is through repetition. Reading the same book repeatedly, not necessarily back to back. You finish it, you begin it again, although you're more than welcome to do that. But what I'm talking about is more of a rhythm of returning to certain books. What I have found I tend to do is associate certain books with seasons. And what I like about this repetition of reading is it returns me, the reader, to the same text at different stages of my life. And it helps reveal differences within myself as I return to the same text year in and year out. There's this great Chuck Klosterman quote that a book becomes popular in its time because of the text, but a book lives on forever because of its subtext. And the books that are worth rereading are often these books that have this wonderful subtext that you can dig into and just live in, year out. And of course, this main idea of repetition comes from one of my favorite philosophers, Kierkegaard. He has this book called Repetition, an essay in experimental psychology. And in it, just a good, simple passage to get the idea across. He writes, "For it is only of the new one grows tired. Of the old one never tires." And I certainly think this is true when it comes to literature and books. Older books, classics, if you will, are far more easy to return to year after year and still get something out of them. I don't have the book, but Calvino, in his book, I think it's called Why Read the Classics, says something along the lines of, a classic text never finishes having something to say. And so when you return to it year after year, you will find new things that the text has to say that you did not find before. So what does this seasonal cadence look like? By chance, for me, really, particular works became associated with certain seasons. So in the fall, I tend to read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I'm very excited about the movie that was just released, directed by Guillermo del Toro, because I read this book every year, and I've been waiting for a new and fresh adaptation that perhaps more closely tracks the source material, because it's really quite a beautiful book, a romantic book ultimately, and that's been lost in the various pop culture translations to movies and television. And moving into the winter, as I've mentioned before, I like to read Sherlock Holmes. Also, I like to read Charles Dickens. Seems to be a very wintry author for me. The spring, I don't really have anything I return to regularly, but I think that's okay. I quite like that, because what is spring if not something new? And I find that's a great time to inject a new text, perhaps a recently published text that I want to read. And in the summer, I often like to read The Great Gatsby, one of those great texts with so much subtext that you can return to it year after year, and it always has something to say. Now, why does this work so well for me? Why does returning to these texts not become boring and uninteresting? Well, what happens when you repeat readings, when you return to these texts, is you convert calendar time to interpretive time. So instead of thinking in 12 months a year, I've got 4 quarters or how many weeks or what have you, you're thinking in terms of the mood of the season, the temperature, the lighting and how dark it gets and how light it stays, the length of the days. And these act as a meta text over the books that you start to associate with that turn of the season. Every late summer, I look forward to the temperature chilling and dipping into Frankenstein once again. And so one thing you can do to prepare perhaps which text you want to read for an upcoming season is take your notebook, a page in your notebook, and make a quadrant, so 4 different squares, and just have the season in one quadrant, the text that you are considering in another quadrant. Why that text for that season you can write in the 3rd quadrant. And finally, what are you looking for when you consider reading this text in this season? Why is this drawing you in, so to speak? So what do you gain when you do this repetition? The first is essentially a deeper pattern recognition for this text. So there are motifs, structural echoes in the books that you simply cannot pick up on the first time you read something. They just start to surface as you return to them again and again. And they simply are not visible when you first go. It's not unlike when you visit a city for the first time. Everything seems new. There are simply things you're not seeing because there's so much going on that you can only compute a sort of basic idea of how to orient yourself. But the more time you spend in that same city, the more granular your understanding becomes, and you're able to process more and more detail every time you go down a particular street, for example. So the same thing happens with these texts, these books, is you'll just see deeper and deeper grain within the text itself. That subtext will surface. Secondly, you'll get that ingrained familiarity that I've already mentioned. So you'll far more easily be able to quote these classic texts. And really, there's nothing that makes you sound more interesting, if that's a goal for you, than being able to quote or even just talk about what happens in some of these books in detail. Something I really enjoy sharing with some of my religious friends is there's a story in Sherlock Holmes, in the very first story, A Study in Scarlet, I believe, where halfway through, the investigation has really got stuck for Sherlock, and then you jump to Utah in America, and you have this whole story of the early Mormon church. And that is what gives you this context. But what you see Conan Doyle doing there is providing kind of a wholehearted critique of Mormonism in the middle of this Sherlock Holmes story. And bringing that up as a discussion piece, as a conversation starter, I've done a few different times with different groups of people. And it's just wonderful to see people genuinely interested in something that most people don't know because they're not necessarily reading these stories. But because I've read that story so many times, I am able to bring it up in conversation and answer questions people have about what is the story exactly? Why am I bringing this up? I'm able to back that up with the evidence of having read the text multiple times. And you don't just have to do this, to impress people. It may not even be that impressive, but as I've mentioned before, when you watch these television shows like The Office or Friends that people seem to watch on repeat, you're able to quote them so freely. How wonderful is it to be able to do that just for yourself with some of the great literature that we have available to us, as opposed to brilliantly written, though they are, sitcoms, right? Something else it yields is a mirror for you. So the text itself becomes a mirror. As you return to the same texts, you will see how you have changed between the time that you last read it and now. This is kind of an aside, but this is something I really enjoy about reading children's stories, especially the ones that I read as a child, because you pick up things that simply were not there for you, or they were there, but you weren't seeing them as a child. And especially now that I have my own, young though he already is, reading him these children's stories like The Wind in the Willows. What joy it is to read these, even though they are well trodden, but returning to them has a special sort of joy. But even with something like Frankenstein or The Great Gatsby, I recall the first time I read The Great Gatsby was in the equivalent of high school. In England, I was perhaps 15. And I enjoyed it. I found it interesting. It's one of the first books that kind of got me into literature, you could say. And my annotations in the copy that I still have from back then are elementary and don't show much care for the book. But when I started rereading the book regularly in my mid-20s, boy, now that I was about the age that perhaps these characters were, or get close to it, the feelings that they have that come through on the page just hit me that much harder. And now that maybe I'm even on the other side of that, but I can still connect to that, and brings me back to that own time in my own life. It's a wonderful thing. And I can now recall where I was emotionally, spiritually, existentially in previous readings of the book. And it gives me just a wonderful perspective on things. And you get that with each book. When I read Frankenstein, I fondly remember sitting by the fireside in England on those very, very short autumn days and reading it and just enjoying that book for the first time. And now I get to do that in my own home, also by the fire. And so you just have that wonderful repetition, sort of not a nostalgia, but memories baked into the books that you return to. And it is a wonderful way to store memories for your life. And finally, you get like an ethical maturation of especially some of these more difficult texts. Sherlock Holmes, Frankenstein, The Great Gatsby, they're not particularly difficult. But I vividly recall when I was first getting into Kierkegaard, and I was just so enamored by this story in one of his texts, Fear and Trembling. And I bought a copy of the book and was trying to read it, and I did not understand anything at all. I was stuck, and I just kept with it. I just really wanted to get this book. It seemed so interesting that I would just return to those same 2 or 3 first pages and read them again and again and again. And a few months would go by, I'd read them again. And that repetition, it's much like training your muscles in a workout or learning an instrument. Is ultimately, it is something to practice. Reading is a skill. Being able to read well, to read verbose books full of a large vocabulary and understand what's being said is a skill to practice. And frankly, just returning to a difficult text over and over is how you go from feeling unable to read books to being able to read pretty much anything. Similarly to my Fear and Trembling experiences when I went to law school, my first semester, they assign you these cases to read, and I considered myself a good reader, but I had absolutely no idea how to read a legal case. I just read unlike anything else. But over the course of the semester, of course, I learned how to read legal cases. And by the end, I could skim and identify how judges are structuring their case opinions, highlighting the issues, what their findings are. All of this became second nature to me. And that wasn't something I recognized. I just found myself doing that and thought, wow, it wasn't that long ago. I had no idea what I was doing. And so this repetition can help you get better at reading, which if you're interested in reading, I'm sure you want to be as good as possible, so that when you find a book that you want to read, you're not the reason you can't read it. All right, so what do you actually need to do this repetition? Well, first you obviously need the book, and I would recommend using a physical copy of a book instead of an ebook for this sort of exercise. Preferably something that's durable. Hardbacks perhaps are preferable, but I have a lot of paperbacks that I read year after year, and they get a bit banged up, but they're still together, which is really all they need to do. My copy of The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy is particularly beaten up to the point that the cover actually has started disintegrating and the spine is completely gone. But it still works. But I really ripped that book to shreds when I was doing an analysis of it back in 2013 now, it must be. And so just have a copy and perhaps even multiple copies of some of these books. And then again, I always recommend having a pencil to mark up your books with. You'll see in some of these that I used to use a lot of pen, a lot of highlighter. I don't do that anymore. And I think my respect for the book itself has grown, but really whatever works for you. But I like pencils for this sort of activity, so I can mark things up, mark the paragraphs that I find interesting, highlight words that I don't understand and can look up later, etc. And I just find also reading with a pencil in hand helps keep me engaged with the text. And then I always try and keep some index cards around, so that the great bookmarks, but also you can make notes of interesting passages, chapters, page numbers, and then that's something that can just travel with the book. As you return to it, you'll see what you found interesting times past. And then a section in your notebook, I think, is helpful too for seasonal rereads. And we'll touch on what that will look like in just a moment. Now, you can just reread the book every year and enjoy that and be fine, and you'll still reap some of these benefits that I've discussed, especially as a mirror, the ingrained familiarity, the ethical maturation. All of these will be there, but if you want to kind of take it to the next level, do it with a bit more intentionality, here's a few methods that can help you do that. So first is, when you approach a book again, just do a sort of reorientation, especially if it's non-fiction, like a philosophy book like Kierkegaard's Repetition. Just take a look at it, remind yourself what the broad structure is. If there's a table of contents, just browse through that. If not, like in this case, just take a look at, okay, here's some letters, 2 parts, as written in the title. Of course, Part 1 and Part 2 are both titled Repetition, rather slyly. And review your old notes, your old marginalia in the book that you've marked up with your pencil. And then go to your journal and journal a forecast. Thoughts after a year of not reading the book, and then forecasting what you think you might get from it this year that you haven't got from it before. And then, of course, just read the book slowly through the season. You're in no rush here. And frankly, even if you don't finish the book, that's fine. You can put it away and pick it up next season, and that's fine. There's no real rules here. You can do what you like, especially if you're looking at a longer book. Although most of my seasonal books are shorter, just so I can read them amongst all the other things I like to read. And as you do this sort of slow reading, just copy thoughts or passages into your index cards or for your Zettelkasten, or into your journal for you to review later. And finally, once you're done reading the book for the season, just journal about what themes, what quotes, what ideas just are stuck with you during this reading. And after a while, you'll be able to see how that changes over time. Now, your journal can act as a spine of repetition. They can be the thread that runs through each season reread. And I don't want you to just keep a reading log. Remember, we're not interested in just keeping track of how many books you read, but think of it more as an index of repetition. So you can take a double page spread of your journal. On the left-hand side, first keep that index maybe in the front of a journal that's specific for this, or just on your next available page in your journal. Title it Seasonal Rereads, and just keep an index of the books that you are rereading, and then the seasons and the years that you do. And then for each reread, take a double page spread. On the left page, you can write the context of the current season. So what's going on in your life right now that might affect how you read this book? And just write that down on the left-hand side of the page. Then on the right-hand side of the page, write down the actual shifts that you observed as you were reading it. On that left side of the page, the context for the season. Where are you in life? What projects are you working on? What moods have you been in? What events are you going to? So for example, right now, if I were to fill this out, I would talk about becoming a father, talk about the work that's going on in my life, perhaps this YouTube channel, talk about the void issue that just came out. And then on the right-hand side of the page, talk about the shifts I observe in the text. What am I noticing this time? What seems different? And so again, if I'm reading Frankenstein right now as a new father, perhaps I'm thinking more acutely about creating someone and the consequences of that creation and the responsibility that I hold for that person's moral actions, in a way that I'm not thinking about that as a single 18-year-old boy, essentially. And once you fill out those 2 pages, return to that journal entry each year as part of your reorientation. Start the text again and ask yourself, do I still agree with what I wrote on those pages last time? What has changed since I last wrote that? And is there a new question that I'm trying to bring into this text for this year? And perhaps you can write the answers to those on an index card that you keep in the book as well. And over many years, the book itself, with its marginalia, your journal entries and your index cards, creates a map of repetition. It will show you how your relationship with the text has deepened and evolved, and the texture of your thoughts has shifted over time. Now to address some common objections to rereading books again and again. The first one just simply being that for every book I reread, that's a new book that I'm not reading, and so my total book count is less. Again, I'm not so bothered about the number of books that I read. You can see I have a number of books. This isn't even all of them. I have a bit of a problem, perhaps. But you have a choice, really, of breadth or depth. And you're welcome to choose breadth, and many do. But given the amount of absolute garbage being published now, there's no guarantee that a new book you pick up is going to be any good. That's simply a fact, unfortunately. And yet we have these time-proven classics available at our fingertips, often very inexpensively, far less expensive than new books these days. And you can have such a better experience, a guaranteed good experience with some of these classics. So again, I really wouldn't be worried about your total book count. And second, the concern that you just will get bored of reading the same books over and over again. And of course, the better the book, the better its subtext, the less likely this is to happen, but it may still happen. And again, you're in control here. There's no harm in skipping 1 year of reading Frankenstein or The Great Gatsby, for example. I certainly don't read them every single year, but it is sort of the rhythm that I am in, and not reading them is the exception rather than the rule. To go back to that quote from Calvino at the beginning, the texts always have more to say for these classics. Now, I'm not rereading, James Patterson not rereading the same James Patterson book every year. These are classics that give that rewarding, repetitive experience. And if you do get bored, just read a different book. It's not a big deal. So, in conclusion, repetition converts calendar time to interpretive time. It helps you form a longitudinal conversation with a book. And so if you made it this far in the video, reflect on what might be a good winter book for you to read or reread this winter. Date a spread. Write a 2-sentence forecast of what you think you might get out of this book this winter. And happy reading.